Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Classical Revolution here on IDAGIO. My name is Rachel Fenlon. I am the host of this series in which I'm chatting with weekly guests about pushing boundaries in classical music and what thinking outside the box is and what breaking rules feels like. Today, I'm really thrilled to be joined by pianist and composer Timo Andres, sorry. Timo is, I'm a really big fan of his work. He just taught me how to pronounce his name, so I had to correct myself. I'm a huge fan of his work. He is a recording artist with the Nonesuch record label. He's been commissioned for his work by the LA Phil, Carnegie Hall, Boston Symphony, the Britten Symphonia. And as a soloist, a pianist, he's performed recitals from Wigmore Hall to Carnegie, Lincoln Center, San Francisco. He collaborates frequently with musicians like Philip Glass, John Adams, Gabriel Cahan, and Brad Meldau. He was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize for his piano concerto for Jonathan Miss, and he is the recipient of the very prestigious Glenn Gould Protégé Prize, for which he was awarded and recommended the prize by Philip Glass. So I'm really pleased to have him on the show today. Please welcome Timo Andres. Hi, Timo.
Thank you, Rachel. Nice to be here. Nice to have something to look forward to on a day like today.
No kidding. A, for being here, and B, for agreeing to do it on this kind of day. So thank you.
Well, it's one never knows what's going to happen. I've sort of learned over the past 4 years or so that I always sort of expect the worst and stupidest thing to happen. So I mentally prepare myself for that in my mind. And that way I'm not like too shocked like when it does. So yeah, that's my general strategy for coping.
Okay, I wouldn't say I'm far off from you. Not to be, it's not about pessimism. It's coping. Different.
It's no, because I'm not a pessimist. I consider myself to actually be a hopeful person and an idealist. But I'm also a realist, and I think if you have lived through the last 4 years in this country, I think you've been paying attention to what's going on, you've learned a lot, as I certainly have. I think they say that like one of the privileges of living in a functional democracy is like not having to pay attention to politics and like not having to really like learn about the judiciary system and like the electoral college and like all that kind of internecine stuff. It's like I kind of see what they mean now, because it's like we've all had to go deep on that stuff over the past 4 years and be like, oh, okay, so like how actually do they appoint like federal judges, and like, okay, what counties is this election going to come down to? It's like all this stupid stuff we shouldn't need to care about, like in an ideal world. But there you go.
Yeah, totally. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. But we could probably talk about that, the whole conversation. And I would love to hear some of your musical background and musical ideas, and maybe distract ourselves a bit. So I would love to first hear what your introduction to music was. And something I love asking my guests is whether there were any particular musical moments that stuck out, that you feel like later really shaped your path.
I mean, I didn't start music particularly early. I always loved listening to music when I was a very young kid. I can remember, learning how to operate the stereo and learning how to operate the record player and sort of putting on my favorite tapes, that sort of thing. And my parents had a pretty good collection of classical records, as well as a sort of smattering of folk music. I I had the sound of orchestral music and piano music in my ear from a pretty early age, but it never occurred to me that it was something I could do really. And then a little later on, my dad was a professional technology journalist. So from actually a pretty early on in what we think of as like Silicon Valley, was writing about computers and computer technology, and so we were always being sent tech products that he would review or write about, and he was sent an electronic keyboard that had a software component. So you hooked up, it was a MIDI keyboard that you hooked up to your Mac. And the software would give you piano lessons. And so he started me on this as kind of his experiment, as kind of like the gimmick of his article, I guess, just to see like, how does it actually work? And I just really took to it. I loved learning the chords and learning the little tunes that it taught you how to play, like Ode to Joy and stuff. And so I kind of whizzed through this program and as it sort of concurrently started writing things down, little pieces. And I mean, you could hardly call them pieces, but I barely knew how to notate music, much less play it. But the impulse to sort of write stuff down, I guess, was always there for whatever reason. And so from there, my parents were like, oh, maybe, Timo seems to like this. Maybe we should get him a real piano teacher. And so I got a real piano teacher. They sort of bartered with some neighbors for a little spinet piano that we had. And it just sort of kept going from there. I always was very self-directed and sort of self-motivated as a kid. And my parents were very good about sort of going out of their way to let me be able to do these things. So, within a few years, I was going into New York City for my piano lessons. I grew up in Connecticut, so a couple of hours from the city. It's sort of just slowly escalated from there. I mean, I wouldn't say I was a prodigy or anything, but it was always sort of the thing that I was best at when I was growing up, and the thing that I really loved to do. I never loved like school or academic work really. But I was always very self-motivated when it came to practicing and composing, and classical music became sort of the thing that I loved to listen to, and I didn't really look outside of that until I got to college, really. So yeah, I was very much a classical music kid growing up, and there were lots of moments along the way, but that's the short answer.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, interesting that it was so self-motivated, actually. That's quite rare, I would say.
Well, I think it was, I fully credit my parents for this. They really didn't want to be like stage parents. So I never felt pressure from anyone to do anything. It was always like what I wanted to do. And I was lucky to have the type of parents, first of all, and also the type of teachers who let me be self-directed and kind of didn't impose their own program on me and kind of drum the love of it out of me.
Yeah.
So my piano teacher, whose name was Eleanor Hancock, when I was growing up, was also very much like that. I mean, she was someone who gave me a very firm technical foundation while simultaneously letting me kind of pursue my musical interests in a way that she didn't really ever question. So, you know, when I was 15 or 16 and I announced that I wanted to play the Charles Ives Concord Sonata, the second piano sonata, she was just like, oh, okay, I don't know it, but I'll learn it along with you. And I give her, enormous credit for just, saying yes to things like that and sort of allowing me at a very early age to pursue my own interests. And I think that's part of the reason that I never had that like burnout moment that sometimes young musicians get.
Yeah, that makes it makes a lot of sense. Those are such formative years, right? And it's
Mhm.
amazing what you said about your teacher as well, that she just really encouraged that curiosity. I think that's really
Absolutely,
special.
yeah.
Um, I'm always so fascinated by composers, composer pianists or composer instrumentalists, because it's so enviable, right? I was curious to ask you a couple of questions. When you're composing for your instrument, is the process different if you're composing for yourself versus composing for another pianist?
A little bit, yes. I mean, I try and take each instrumentalist's or each musician's particular qualities into account in whatever I'm writing for them. And that goes for everyone. I mean, violinists, singers, ensembles. But yeah, of course, I'm particularly tuned into kind of the things that differentiate pianists from each other. So I do very much sort of, I like to know, what's the repertoire that they enjoy playing the most or that they kind of specialize in. What is the particular quality that they bring to that repertoire? I mean, in the case of Jonathan Biss, who I've written for a couple of times, I'd certainly known his playing before I began to write for him, and it was this very kind of simultaneously kind of intellectual kind of almost like he's teaching you the music as he's playing it, but simultaneously like it's like a very animated form of teaching, if that makes sense. It's like a very like listening to a very impassioned lecturer on a subject that they really know backwards and forwards. That was sort of a quality that I tried to imbue in the pieces that I wrote for him. And it's been something that's it's always a challenge because I have particular things that just kind of physically that my hands do on a keyboard that I gravitate towards. That I will indulge those tendencies when I'm writing for myself and then try to second guess them writing for other pianists whose whose physiology might be different.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and definitely something I was curious about. On those, thinking for myself, if I was composing, I would perhaps have to fight certain instincts to indulge in things that I really enjoy, either physically or musically. So it's
Well,
interesting.
And I've also, I mean, the other side of that is this kind of like identity of a pianist composer that you mentioned, is something that I've always actually been a little bit suspicious of. Like any instrumentalist composer who's maybe too grounded in their instrument when it comes to their writing, it's something that I for a long time tried to consciously separate myself from a little bit, just because I think the temptation to do what's expedient and to do what's what kind of, we know how to make our instrument sound good and how to make it sound impressive, but that's not the same thing as writing a good piece. And I think that is a trap that a lot of instrumentalist composers can fall into sometimes. So it's something I'm always asking myself, like, oh, am I going too far in kind of the Paganini direction, or things like that.
That's really cool. And flip side of that, I'm curious, as an interpreter, well, I was curious about two things. Do you feel, I mean, it's difficult to add, do you feel as an interpreter that being a composer offers you some kind of broader component or spectrum to interpret, or has it influenced? But I suppose you always kind of did the two simultaneously, as composer and interpreter.
I always felt that they fed into each other, to a great extent, and I still do. And I think that the things that I've learned about music from being a composer have certainly influenced my a bit, and increased my ability to interpret music. I feel, and that's something that I think continues to increase. I mean, I think I've always learned music best by, physically sort of getting my hands dirty. And most of the moments that I can recall of experiencing something that was musically new to me, and having that be really influential, were moments when I was discovering it as a pianist. And that those things would then kind of work their way into my compositional life, the way any influences do, kind of end up very much on the surface of whatever it was I was working on at the time, and sort of gradually filter down into a more kind of base level of the sort of toolbox of things that I do compositionally. So I continue very much to feel that way, and that it's also kind of, composers tend to be very opinionated and very kind of, we like what we like, and sometimes the temptation to be dismissive of something that appears to be contrary to what we like and what we do and what we feel we stand for as composers. Sometimes that temptation is very strong. It's easy to dismiss things. And when you're an interpreter, when you're a performer, that mindset is extremely unhelpful. It's counterproductive, in fact. You kind of need to put yourself in a place where you are trying to think like whatever composer it is, whether it's, this week I'm practicing like Ives and Julie Wolfe and Copeland, and it's like, whatever it is, whatever sort of interpretational problems or pianistic problems that I encounter, I'm kind of putting myself in that composer's place and thinking like, okay, but why did they write it like this? Like there has to be a reason, like it's not random. And I find that that's a really useful exercise for developing a kind of, I guess, let's call it musical empathy, that you can learn to empathize with others, another composer's decisions, even if they're not the same ones that you would make in your own work.
That's really, that's such a fascinating thought, actually. And interesting that you actually firsthand get to have that experience as a composer.
Well, and
yeah,
I love to being on the other side of that, of you know, working
exactly.
with other living composers and helping their musical ideas come to light. And it's something that I've done here and there over my career, is like commission new works. The most recently from wonderful young composer, well, not young, but younger than me, Gabriella Smith. And you know, being able to sort of bring her piece into the world was really exciting, and that's certainly something I want to jump at the chance to do more.
There's this sense for me of like fluidity, harmonically, also in style. And I was curious what your thoughts are on something that I chat with the guests weekly about anyway, is this thought about genre and what genre is and whether, how relevant that is. And I would love to hear your thoughts about that, because it feels for me music is very much free from that somehow. So,
well, I appreciate
free
that.
from being a certain thing.
I very much appreciate you saying that, because I think it's something that I believe quite strongly, is that, you know, genre is just a collection of certain stylistic traits. And by stylistic traits, I mean surface qualities of music. It's not necessarily how the music is put together or what's going on structurally or conceptually. It's decisions like, what kind of instruments do you use and how do you write for them, and what kind of singers are you writing for, and are they using microphones or not, or even just like what kind of venues is your music performed in. It's like all of these things that are associated with the music and relevant to it, but are not necessarily things that we the things that we think about most deeply as composers. And that's a I think something that can be difficult for people to understand sometimes, because one quote unquote genre of music will seem to be so different from another. But I think when you talk to more and more composers and creators of music coming from these kind of different corners of musical establishment, the more you talk to them, the more their concerns in making music are the same. And we may use different words to mean the same thing. That sometimes even, you know, different language associated with different sort of styles. But the more I kind of work in different corners of the musical world, the more I think I begin to see what's similar about them rather than what's different. And I think that anyone who's sort of curious about music and who listens to music with an open mind and an open ear will start to find themselves sort of wandering in between these sort of silos that the industry has set up for us, that it wants to categorize us in. And that those can start to be really unhelpful, or at least just kind of nonsensical. I mean, I know, you know, certainly for a lot of composers of my generation, it's like the decision of how to just market their music is like when you actually like make a list of sort of stylistic traits and compare those with other sort of categories of music, the distinction is really quite vanishing. And it, you know, I'm thinking of, for example, like a friend of mine, Jacob Cooper, wonderful composer, who writes beautiful, kind of spacious, mostly songs, mostly vocal music, with electronic tracks. And, you know, it's basically pop music. The singers are amplified. They're singing in a more or less a pop style. The electronics are beat based, you know, they're very much like sequenced and produced like pop, what we would call pop music. And, you know, for whatever reason, he's categorized as a classical music composer. They know, there are things that I think are more in that direction. His songs tend to be longer than most pop tracks. He tends to, rather than write his own lyrics, he tends to commission poets to do it for him. So that's sort of more of like a more of like a song music cycle. Yeah, more of an art music type of arrangement. But you know, I think anyone it's like anyone who listens to like Aphex Twin or something, I think would maybe find more familiar in his music than someone who is coming from listening to Winterreise.
Right. No, I think those are that's so well put, and so many great points. I think, you know, when you're talking about how we do essentially to categorize music, and you're absolutely right that by categorizing it in this way, also generally gravitate to what the differences are between those things versus what the similarities are. So I thought that was a very interesting point, because I noticed myself even do that. When you're comparing things, you often compare the differences versus where actually they all meet and then where they're dispersing. And it also made me think about, as someone on your playlist, everyone, you should definitely check out Timo's playlist, which is linked on this episode.
Oh, I think I put a Jacob Cooper track on there.
Yes, you did. And you also put some Laurie Anderson, which I thought that's also, for me, that, you know, that could be anything. And
right, like where does she fit in? It's like, is she a singer-songwriter? Is she a composer? Is she a performance artist? Is she like the original podcaster? Like,
totally.
like all of the above.
Yes. Exactly. No, and I thought that was also a great point about that ultimately the concerns are always the same, or are the same musically. That's something interesting to think about. I'm curious for you whether there are any other, I'm sure there are many, art forms that you gravitate towards, either in appreciation or in practice, like film or art, where you sort of draw a lot of inspiration from.
I do tend to think very visually, and I think that's part of what drew me to notated music in the first place. Was I simply liked how it looked on the page, and I can remember liking how it looked from a very early age. I did, you know, a lot of art growing up, and even through college and grad school, studied art on the side. It's not really a practice that I've kept up with any regularity, though I do find great satisfaction from it when I kind of do little art projects, and I guess I do. The main kind of visual component of my work is sort of the design elements that are associated with it. So, you know, I enjoy designing my own website and doing my own scores and all the sort of cover matter associated with those. And I guess it's more sort of the crass commercial graphic design aspect of visual art, but it's all, I don't know, there is something about like the graphic arts in particular that I've always really been interested in, is like, because I think there's an aspect of graphic design and sort of, you know, all of these things associated with it, logo design, poster design, typesetting, book design, that yes, it's not purely a work of art in and of itself. It has a sort of commercial purpose, but there's an aspect of having to distill a message down to its clearest form that I find really attractive. And it's something that, you know, I've always kind of loved about modernist design, which I find so lacking in modernist music, which seems to me to be about obscuring your message as much as possible. It's so funny to me how differently those two things ended up, and how one really caught on with the public and the other didn't at all. I do. I love you know, looking, and I guess you can sort of see by, I'm actually sitting at my piano right now, and you can sort of see the different
Yeah, I can
things that
see
I've
some
surrounded
beautiful
myself.
artwork behind you there.
It's on all sides. It's sort of surrounding, and I
Oh,
try
wow.
to rotate it out every so often to you know, keep it fresh. But yeah, I've got some modernist posters, the Goldsworthy prints, wonderful sculptor. This is Charles Ives back behind me, painted by my friend Alex Sopp, and yeah, a few other things. It's so yeah, the visual component is definitely there, and definitely very strong.
Hmm. Something is whether you consciously think about the subject of time as a composer. And I mean, outside of, I mean, in any context, and how, if so, how does that manifest in your work? Just this, or does it?
Well, I mean, music is a time-based medium, right? So yeah, I think you'd be a fool to not think about time. You'd have to work very hard not to think about it. Yeah, so I mean, it's simultaneously the basis of the medium, and the hardest thing to control about it. And I think it tends to be the thing that composers learn to do last in terms of teaching them. And I was just, you know, someone sent me a recording of a performance they did of one of my pieces a few days ago, a piece from, I think, 2007. So I had just graduated from college, I guess, when I wrote it. And I I was just listening to this piece thinking like, wow, I really had no idea how to control musical form at that time. Like, it was like, sometimes I got it, you know. There are pieces from that time I think like, okay, that piece still works. It's like, it has a good form, uses its time well. and this piece, I was just like, oh God, this is so wandering and so sort of hairy, and it's so diffuse. And I was like getting bored listening to it, honestly. But it is a very hard thing to control because it's not really a parameter that we're used to thinking about in terms of music. I mean, we're used to thinking about melody and about rhythm and even about harmony, especially classical music tends to be very focused on harmony. But we don't so much talk about structure and sort of large gestures, large blocks of music, how they relate to each other. Certainly that's something that wasn't talked about so often in my training as an instrumentalist. If we talk about sort of chunks of music, we tend to talk more about like phrase to phrase, 8 bars here, 8 bars there. And those are the building blocks of musical structure, but you have to learn how to think bigger and to zoom out further and take the bird's eye view. And that, for me was a hard thing to learn. And it definitely was not until I would say well into college that I even started to be able to think about it. One thing that really changed my thinking about musical form was when I discovered the music of the minimalists and post-minimalists. Of course, they don't like to be called that, but again, we have to use a label for a group of people who don't really fit under it. But that happened sort of early in college for me. And learning to listen to that type of music and not just hear the repetition and sort of how static it is on the surface, and to, if you're coming from a classical music perspective, it's like, okay, why isn't anything happening in this music? Like, when will it modulate or whatever? And learning to not listen to music that way. I mean, I think that's to this day why a lot of classical music people have trouble with Philip Glass's music, because we're coming to it from this perspective of like, oh, it's the sonata form, and you have the A theme and the B theme, and you have the development, and it's like these things all have to fit together harmonically a certain way. And his music just totally rejects that, and it also equally rejects the kind of pitch, the kind of pitch relations of modernism. So his music, early Steve Reich pieces, all the pieces that were written in the sort of music as a gradual process era, those were really big for me and continue to be really big for me, even though I don't think you would listen to my music now and think, oh, that's minimalist music, or even that's influenced by minimalist music. But that was sort of key for me to learn how to think about big blocks of music in time and how they change or don't change according to all the various different parameters that we can control as composers. And in a way, my learning to zoom out and take the bird's eye view was just me applying those ideas to other music that came before it, and sort of looking at it in reverse, and sort of thinking about the Waldstein Sonata as a gradual process, so that was in a way more helpful to me than learning how to like analyze harmony or do figured bass or even learning about sonata form, because it seemed to me to be such a composery way of looking at things, especially now that in the 20th century and into the 21st, we aren't working with set forms anymore. I mean, there tend to be formal devices that are reused and used by different composers, and we can compare and contrast them. But for a long time now, composers have been expected to sort of come up with our own forms, and that makes things a little harder. That sort of levels the game up from writing a cantata every week, or writing writing 40 symphonies, or not to say that those accomplishments aren't perfectly valid, but I think it's why composers now tend to be a little less productive on the whole. We tend to write fewer pieces, we tend to write more slowly, and I think we tend to kind of feel this compulsion to reinvent things more. And I don't know whether that's sort of a hangover from this modernist dogma that you had to be constantly innovating. You had to be the sort of progressive teleological view of the art form, which I actually don't believe in at all. And I think is probably more destructive than helpful. But I do think that there is a bit of that, each new piece, you have to tear it all down and start from scratch feeling. That still sort of pervades the field.
Yes. And it's kind of like you said, when you're talking about minimalism and how you can take that to the Waldstein, or it's this broad spectrum that we have to always sort of live within and be kind of inhabiting this huge broad spectrum. And but it's really, no, that's really interesting. Yeah. That's, yeah. I'm curious. I heard that one of your favorite, I read somewhere that one of your favorite operas is Lulu, or it's like your favorite opera. Does that still ring true? This was in an article somewhere.
I'm trying to recall where you would have read that. I mean, I don't actually know Lulu very well. Opera, okay. My relation to opera has always been one of sort of arm's length curiosity, I would say.
Okay.
I don't know opera very well, and it's actually not something that was a part of my musical upbringing really at all, and not really one of my aspirations either.
Okay, that was one of my questions.
That is funny. I mean, I go to the opera. Well, I used to go to the opera. And there are operas that I love, but I find contemporary opera to be so full of pitfalls and so kind of just kind of such a dangerous area to tread in. I would prefer to maybe spend my time some other way. I mean, also just because, like, for some reason all composers want to write opera now, and I don't quite understand it. I guess because the bigger works tend to filter to the top of what gets attention, and they get publicity and they get prizes, and they're more visible. But they're also, I find this this dynamic in the compositional field of, like, with increasing visibility comes decreasing usefulness. It's like how many people are going to put on your opera like in your lifetime? You know, maybe there's a slim chance that you'll be like a John Adams or someone, and like your operas get done fairly regularly all over the world. But you know, chances are they'll be put up once or twice, and you know, never again. I would prefer to write music that gets played regularly by working musicians, and that, you know, smaller groups in maybe more kind of grassroots scenarios can put together without too much hassle. And that's one of the things I find a little bit sad about, you know, kind of it seems like there's this dynamic where like the bigger you get as a composer, or like the more famous or more successful, the bigger pieces you start to write. And you just, you know, every commission has to be like a half-hour large orchestra piece or an opera, or like, it's just, okay, I mean, it's amazing that you're able to operate at that level of the musical world, because very few people are. But it also leaves less time for writing the small chamber works, you know, the string quartets, the solo piano pieces, the combinations of odd instruments that for some reason get taken up and get played all the time, you know? And like, I don't know, I that's often the stuff by composers that I love the most, is kind of these more chamber music, more solo music works. And I don't know, I'm just thinking back to like my introduction to John Adams was not Nixon in China, was not, it was not like Harmony Lara or one of these major pieces. It was road movies, the Violin Sonata, which yeah, I mean, it's he has very little chamber music in the scheme of things. And I was introduced to this piece because a violinist hired me to accompany her recital, and she was playing it. I was I think a freshman in college at the time, and you know, that piece was in its own way kind of revolutionary to me. And that certainly led me to Nixon in China and all the rest. But it was the gateway drug.
Yeah.
And it's not a piece that anyone who was writing about John would say, oh, here is the piece. Like, this is the piece you need to know. And like, this is the important piece. But I don't know. I love chamber music, and I never want to stop writing it. And I'm lucky in that my chamber music is performed, and I'm self-published, so I see the orders coming in. I see whenever anyone plays my music, and I love nothing more than see someone order a string quartet or a solo piano piece, and you know, have it go out into the world and make its own little journey.
Exactly. I mean, I'm definitely of the. I mean, I do love opera as well, but I would agree with you as well when it comes to the chamber music and it just being some of the great composers. That's most of my favorite work is the chamber. When I think about Brahms and even Beethoven, and then the sonatas for me before the symphonies and everything. So
right. I mean, for me, like, the archetype for a composer has always been Brahms. I mean, you can say like whatever you want about that, but for me, it's like, and this goes back to when I was, you know, a kid. This sense of deep craft and deep knowledge of what came before him, and simultaneously having having enough mastery of that to to kind of hide it in a way, and to hide it in under these kind of beautiful forms, these beautiful shells. That to me seems to be like a very satisfying goal to strive to attain. And I don't think he attained it in every piece. I mean, I think there are pieces that you see the gears turning in, not in a good way. But I think that kind of like, and again, like, I think if you surveyed musicians, if you were to survey classical musicians, like what was the music that they found most satisfying to play, or the most fun to play, or just like the most beautiful to play, a lot of them would say Brahms. I know, a lot of my friends would say Brahms, and I think there's something to that. And also just the fact that he was able to apply his craft to a lot of, I guess, what we would call genres now, and not dumb it down at all. But I'm thinking of pieces like the kind of the four hands piano waltzes and Hungarian dances, and like the German Requiem that was written for kind of amateur singers and continues to be done by amateur singers. The
clarinet quintet. I mean, it's
so sort of the whole spectrum. You can, any musician can really find something there and find it kind of equally satisfying.
We're kind of almost at the end, and I definitely want to ask you a couple of more questions. Kind of given the current climate and everything, it made me wonder yourself how you feel you respond to political tension musically. Do you feel that you do?
Well, I feel that I respond to my mood musically. And what can be said about one's mood over the past year? I mean, it's been an incredibly frustrating period of time in so many ways. I'm not a composer who generally seeks to speak to a current political moment kind of specifically. I think there are composers and artists who do that wonderfully, and movingly and intelligently. I think they're few and far between. I think it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And I think, well, if I can put it bluntly for a second, I think over the past 4 years, we've seen a kind of a failure of the sort of cultural project here in this country, at least. I mean, I think we saw that in the 2016 election. We saw it over the past 4 years, that I think we as artists don't really have any power to change things structurally. And I think that when politicians try to harness the power of the arts as a kind of populist or like cultural bludgeon, I think it doesn't work. And I mean, I'm talking about like people at the Beyonce, Jay-Z, Taylor Swift level of artist, not like what we do, which is, you know, nobody cares. But even at that level, I think you could say the politicization of culture has been a dismal failure, because it hasn't resulted in any real any real like demographic shifting of the electorate. It all it serves to do is kind of underscore these already existing divisions that are in place that are so painful, and to sort of highlight the feeling of like, I don't know, I feel so let down by the Democratic Party recently. I mean, over the past 4 years, but today, and you know, I've voted for Democrats my entire life, but I think the politicization of culture is it's a dead end. I mean, I really think that you have to take a hard look at it and say, like, this is not helping. You know, what you need to do is offer people vote in their self-interests, right? You have to offer them something that they really see and say, okay, that is in my self-interest. Not like, oh, vote for me because Katy Perry is voting for me, or vote for me because, you know, your favorite celebrity will think that you're a good person. You know, these are chimeras. So, you know, how does this relate to me as a working artist? I don't know. I mean, the only thing I can do is continue to write my little pieces and play my little concerts, and like I try to do that in a way that's moral, and in a way that is inclusive. And I think, you know, I'm not saying that accessibility isn't a huge problem in our field, because it is. And we all have to be thinking about that. And we all have to be thinking about it in a way that doesn't use it as a bludgeon, you know, that doesn't say like, oh, this group of people, if you like us, then you're good, you know, because I think that is often kind of the subtext of a lot of these efforts. Is like, oh, classical music is good for you. Classical music is universal. Classical music is all these things. I mean, it's just music. It's like oh my God. I mean, don't get me started.
Yeah.
I mean, music is the most abstract art form. And you can have all these things that you associate with music. I mean, I guess lyrics being the primary one. And people like to talk about those things because actually music itself is very hard to talk about. And it makes us feel different ways that are sometimes inexplicable. But all of those things have to do with these very abstract properties. And I think that in the end is what fascinates me about music and what keeps me, kind of keeps me going, you know, because it feels like, still to me feels so mysterious and so kind of limitless in its possibility. So here I guess the long answer is, that's a long answer to say, like, we have to remember the limits of the art form and also the possibilities that are sometimes overlooked.
Yeah. Yeah. That's yeah, that's certainly a lot to
It's a
think
lot.
about and consider, and also that no, but it's absolutely no, it's great. It's so fascinating because it is so much about also questioning the political responsibility that what we're asking politically, for. I think that you're absolutely right. We need to kind of shift that direction, but it's a slow process.
Yeah, I'll say.
I would ask you my last question, which I always love to close with, hence the title of the show, Revolution, Evolution. When has music been revolutionary for you? Or,
Revolutionary. I mean, I think back to that sort of moment when I was 18 or 19, coming out of a very a very fertile but very kind of cloistered musical childhood, and coming into sort of a wider world, and suddenly hearing all this different music and thinking like, how does this all relate to what I do? You know, how does this relate to like me practicing a Prokofiev sonata or whatever I was doing when I was 18? And it's kind of throwing up my hands and saying, you know, I don't know how this all relates to each other, but I'm going to make a decision to keep my ears open to it. And I think that sort of set me on the path that I'm still on, in a way, is that decision that I very consciously made. I remember exactly where I was when I sort of had this thought, that I never wanted to be one of those musicians who was about closing doors and sort of conscribing a space for myself and for my art. That I always wanted to be the kind of artist who was discovering new rooms constantly. And part of that is this idea of musical empathy, of giving everything that you hear kind of a fair shot, no matter what your, you know, this involves like examining a lot of your preconceptions. You know, a lot of people might say like, oh, I like all music, but I don't like country music. You know, that's one you hear a lot.
yeah.
Or you know, I like all types of music, but I don't listen to rap. You know, you have to examine your preconceptions and ask yourself why. You know, what is it about those types of music that you feel like is closed off to you? Because it's not the music's fault. You know, all types of music exist because there's an audience for them, no matter how vanishingly small. I mean, there's some people for whom that hits their eardrums at just the right spot for whatever reason. And I think this exercise of putting ourselves in in that position of being like, okay, what could possibly be? And sometimes it takes a while to find a route into it, you know? Sometimes you may have to wait in order to sort of discover something that makes you think, oh, okay, I kind of get how this is put together. Or like, I understand, like this, came out of that. And it makes you hear it in a whole new way. I mean, I feel like this was around the same time I got into a lot of pop music of the 80s and 90s, kind of in reverse by being really into Brian Eno.
Okay.
And it was like Brian Eno somehow crossed my desk, and I was like, oh, I see how this relates to the minimalism that I've been listening to. And so I got really into Brian Eno. And then I was, because Brian Eno did all sorts of things, and it's like, okay, so more people actually know this guy as a producer. And what is the music he produced sound like? And so, then I started listening to the Talking Heads and to U2 and, all these things. And that's one example of sort of how you can sort of find the side door to a type of music that maybe you wouldn't have had so much of a connection to prior to that. And yeah, I think it's another sort of piece of evidence that music history is not teleological. It's not like, oh, first you have Wagner, and then you have Schoenberg, and then you have Boulez. It's like all of these little pieces of string connecting one thing to something that doesn't seem to be related to it, and it's like all of these things have these connections leading from them, and it's up to you to sort of follow them. So I think the most revolutionary thing you can do is just to be a curious listener, to not listen how the Spotify algorithm tells you to listen, that, because that is, that's whatever the equivalent of fascism is in the arts. I think it's the Spotify algorithm telling everyone what to listen to. It's like, we have to push back against that.
Yeah, we really do. Wow, well, that was, I love that. That's so beautifully put, and thank you.
Well, thank you. It was nice to talk to you today of all days, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for making time, and yeah, it was just really lovely to hear your thoughts on so many things. So
my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
We'll say bye to you for today, and wishing you all the best. We're all with you in solidarity over here in Europe, thinking of all our American friends.
We're thinking of moving there, so watch out.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, good. It's well, So thank you so much, Timo, and to everyone who tuned in today. Also, be sure to check out Timo's playlist. It's full of lots of gems. I really enjoyed listening to it while I was compiling it. So
good.
Definitely check it out. And yeah, thank you so much. And please take care. And